And it hits me, oh my gosh, this is that triangle.
You know, there's explanation for everything that occurred in the Rendlesham Forest incident that doesn't involve aliens at all.
It was completely silent. It comes right over our heads.
He saw a classic flying saucer, really, standing in the clearing.
He turned over to my father and held his hand, and he looked in his eyes, and he said, "We're not alone."
Welcome to Podcast UFO for our live show. We're live every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the Dark Matter Radio Network. Please remember to visit the website podcastufo.com for past episodes, blogs, and forums. During the show, feel free to participate live in our chat room. And don't forget to like us on our very active Facebook page.
Hello, and welcome to the show. This is Martin Willis, your host. And we're doing this whole show live. We're just starting this new situation where I'm making Alejandro Rojas, who'll be coming right up, I'm making him stay late at work so we can do the whole show live. And I want to thank everyone for helping out with the show and supporting the show. And if you'd like to listen to the second hour of the show, it only takes $1 a month or more. All that information is on podcastufo.com right on the sidebar. And we have a live chat room going right now on podcastufo.com, right on the main page. Takes 2 clicks to get in there. You can ask our guest a question later on. And that guest is Peter Davenport from NUFORC. He'll be on for both Hour 1 and Hour 2. So get some questions ready for him. He was one of the first people on the Incident Exeter case back in, I think it was 1965, and that's local to me. And he also has done a bunch of different things. I think he had a sighting early on, too, back in the 50s in his youth. And great guy. I'm really looking forward to that. And that's enough for me. Alejandro, how are you?
I am good. How are you?
I am great in the great state of Maine. And we were just talking about traffic jams in Arizona. And there's hardly even roads here. So
really? Well, that's... I don't know if that's good or bad. It's probably bad, huh? They get all clogged up, I'm assuming?
Well, it's good for the moose. But, yeah, it's...
well, ride a moose. You got to be creative. Think outside of the box.
Well,
Use a moose for transportation.
Tourism here is getting heavier and heavier every year. So when you get anything like, July 4th weekend coming right up, boy, does I-95 goes right up the state of Maine, and it is clogged all over.
Really?
Yeah, it goes way down into New Hampshire. Because there's tolls, they have to go through tolls and stop at a toll, and that clogs everybody up. So it's always a pain. So I like being up in the mountain away from everybody and quiet.
Yeah. Well, I think that gives me an excuse to plug something. And since this is live, you can't stop me.
Where's the mute button? Okay.
Roswell. I'm going to be in Roswell this weekend, so that's exciting.
Right.
It's UFO related. It's going to be like my 8th year or something going out there. I did miss 1 year. But it's always a lot of fun, and they have the most amazing fireworks display. There's a fireworks company out there. So it's like 45 minutes, and you think the whole thing is the finale because they're just tons and tons. I think they just blew up all their extra ones out there. It's incredible. You would not imagine it in this little town in the middle of nowhere in New Mexico. But, of course, it'll be fun, and I will be seeing Tom and Don there and hearing what they have to say. Of course, they are in the limelight. They are quite notorious at this moment because of the Roswell Slides stuff.
Yeah, the lingering.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. We'll see how long it lingers. But, yeah, I promised I wouldn't talk about that. So what's going on with the news?
The news. It's too late. You already did talk about it. But I should mention, not much about it, but today is Canadian Day. Canada Day. Yay. So we do have a story up written by a Canadian, Chris Rutowski, and he runs a site up there where they do a lot of really good work on following sightings. And he wrote this story about the top 10 strangest Canadian UFO reports, and he based it off of UFO researchers and investigators that he polled. So that's kind of fun. That's our Canadian Day story that's up there. And I kind of sprung that on you, so you probably don't have to link up yet. But
yeah, it's not there, you hoser.
Oh, I'm a hoser. I've been refraining from saying A and hoser, even though it's a lot of fun. And before the show started, we were doing quite a bit of it. I just started thinking, if it's Canada Day, shouldn't we be celebrating them and not making fun of them?
We're not. That is celebrating them.
Yeah.
It's
okay.
It'd be awesome to be able to talk like that.
You convinced me, eh?
Yeah, hoser. All right.
So otherwise, though, speaking of other news in other countries, we've posted a story, and this was given to us by Andres Mueller. He has a Fortean kind of website, Frontier Science, he calls it, website in Germany that's very popular. And he'll send us stories once in a while. And this is a really interesting one. So the Federal Administrative Supreme Court of Germany has forced essentially the German government to release this UFO file. I guess they haven't done it yet, but there's a scientific organization that did a report on UFOs, and the German government has not wanted to release this, even though people know it exists. It was created by their scientifical service, is what they call it. And I guess it has to do with Germany and the UN resolution to release UFO information. But it's been kind of a long-fought battle for UFO researchers to see this paper, and soon they will, because it had to go all the way up to the Supreme Court of Germany to release this document. So it's a really interesting file or a story, and that should be coming out soon. And as far as that UN resolution, it actually got watered down. It was a UN, I can't remember the exact word, but something like UN suggestion it came out to be. But if people aren't aware, in the 1970s, Sir Eric Gehry of Grenada got really into UFOs. He said he had a sighting, and he went to the UN as a UN country delegate and said, we need to release information on UFOs and share information, and create a department at the UN that investigates UFOs. It got stalled for a year. This was, I think, 76 to 77 and to 78. And finally, it came out as kind of this UN, I can't remember the word, but it is like a suggestion or something like that, which just means that it got watered down to the point, but it did get voted on and passed on the records where all of the UN countries were to share their UFO information with the UN, and then they would all share it amongst each other in these countries. It never came out to fruition. We've had some interesting stories come out, and Lee Spiegel has written about this because Lee Spiegel actually organized. Yeah, he was involved. He organized a presentation at the UN for this thing. And we have found out later on that the UK government especially was really against the whole thing, and in the background was lobbying against it. So really interesting story, and I guess this German paper is about their implementation of this UN resolution. So it ought to be interesting to see. But pretty cool news there.
Did you get an idea of exactly when that will be released?
No, the story doesn't really go into when it may be released. Just recently the ruling had come down.
I see. Okay.
However, Andres Mueller did get other UFO files recently released, and we have a link to that story, and that's another story he had given us in the past as well. So, of course, we don't speak German, so we got to rely on some of the points that he made on those files. But there's some stuff that's somewhat interesting. It's kind of like the WikiLeaks UFO stuff that came out. It wasn't really exciting or groundbreaking, but it was interesting kind of stuff.
Nein, sprechen Sie Deutsch. Yeah. Sorry.
That's German, isn't it?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
You have latent talents that come out periodically, and you're just an impressive person.
Like blatant, I think, is more like it. Hey, before we go on to the next show, I just want to announce to our listeners that Art Bell is coming back on this network, and it's coming up, I think, I want to get this wrong, I think it's July 20th. And you can actually go to the Dark Matter Radio or Dark Matter Digital, Media Network. It has changed. The URL has changed. And you can find where you can support our art for as little as like $5 a month for a subscription. Listen to all these shows. You know, these shows are 5 days a week. So I am just, I'm looking at, I'm getting a message, I think, from the producer of the show right here. So hang on.
DarkMatterDigitalNetwork.com.
There it is. Thank you, Keith.
Yeah.
Dark Matter Digital Network.
I just knew that.
That's where you want to go. And you can support art. It's Midnight in the Desert. You can see the link right there. And I'm really excited about that. But we can go ahead and move on with the news if you'd like.
Yeah, I'm super excited, too. And what's funny is we wrote a story on that, and we included some of these fan trailers that are popping up on YouTube. And ever since then, I've gotten at least 2 or 3 other messages from people that have said, oh, you know, I created a fan trailer. Check it out. And at least one of them I posted on my Facebook, and the guy was really cool. He's like, oh, thank you. And it was a great trailer. But there's all these fan trailers for Art Bell's show coming up, popping up on YouTube, which is pretty cool. Everybody's really excited about it. I am as well.
Yeah, and I think he'll really like, you know, steering his own boat, being in charge of the digital, you know, in charge of the media he's on, or, you know, of course, with Keith's help, but he'll be in charge, and so there won't be any of the typical BS that's happened to him in the past. So, yeah, it's really exciting.
Very exciting. Speaking of exciting, it's the next exciting finding that I want to share with everybody, which has to do with Bob Lazar. So many of you probably know, of course, Bob Lazar is the alleged whistleblower who came out and said, I worked at Area 51, or specifically at this S4 facility near Area 51, but he kind of flew into Area 51 and was bused there, and he says he back engineered alien technology. Well, he says that he also worked at Los Alamos, which is another secret kind of place where secret kind of projects are worked on, and he says he has degrees from Caltech and MIT. Well, none of this could be confirmed. There's no teachers that have come or no students, colleagues of his that said, oh, yeah, I went to school with him, nor has there been anybody to come forward and say, yeah, I worked with him at Los Alamos. Now, George Knapp, who is an investigative journalist, he's won something like a numerous Emmy Awards. And this guy is a real deal. George Knapp, I'm a huge fan of his. If he says it, it's real. Integrity and journalistic integrity is a big deal to him. I believe what he has to say. And he says he has spoken with people that worked with Lazar at Los Alamos, but they don't want to come forward because they're afraid of getting in trouble. Well, Jeremy Corbell, who you've had on the show, who's done some documentaries, including on Bob Lazar, he debated, and he's had this online debate going on with Stanton Friedman. But he just recently released, just last week, and that when he was on Coast to Coast AM with George Knapp, that he found a physicist who worked at Los Alamos with Bob Lazar, and this guy has been willing to come forward. In fact, I wrote a story about it, and he shared with me this link that talks about this guy. He's Dr. Robert Krangle, and he is a physicist. You know, he's an impressive person. That's why this magazine had done this story on him and some of his work. But this guy has come forward and said, that, yeah, I worked with Bob Lazar. He says, I know Bob Lazar was a physicist with a security clearance at Los Alamos. One of the reasons he knows this is he was in security meetings with Bob Lazar. And these, I guess, are kind of routine meetings where people are told, now remember, you're working on secret projects, so don't tell anybody about it. Apparently, Bob Lazar was asleep at the meetings because he did go out and tell people about it. But he also says, you know, he just knew from being around there that Bob Lazar was a physicist. So it doesn't prove that Bob Lazar was working on alien technology, but what it does demonstrate is that he was a technician and arguably a scientist at Los Alamos. Well, at least it helps bolster that claim. And so the question is, why has Los Alamos been denying that Bob Lazar worked at Los Alamos if he actually did? So it's just more mystery. It could be proving that Bob Lazar isn't lying, at least in that, Los Alamos is trying to erase his existence or working with them there, which is awfully mysterious. And George Knapp makes another point, a couple points, that if we could prove he worked at Los Alamos, who cares about his his degrees? Because Knapp has not been able to confirm that he has these degrees that he claims to have, and that if he was a technician at Los Alamos, which is an important place, then it's possible he did work at Area 51.
I'm still, I got to tell you, I'm going to get some people mad at me, and maybe even you a little bit, but I'm still totally on the fence about Bob Lazar. Now Matt's going to get really mad at me in the message board. But and here's the thing, my brother-in-law was a chemist at Los Alamos for many years, and there was, I had a conversation with him. He says, there's 9,000 to 13,000 people working there at any given time, including about 600 to 800 subcontractors that are working there. There's hundreds and hundreds of buildings. And he said, for him to remember someone that he met that was not close friends with back in the 1980s is basically, I want to say almost impossible. Like, what would make Bob Lazar stand out? He said if he was famous, he was well-known, or, famous in his field or something like that, yes, of course you'd remember him. But if he was not a standout person, it would be really difficult to, to remember him. And how did this come up? How did he all of a sudden say, oh, yeah, I knew Bob Lazar? And I know that some of it had to do with supposedly a friend had given him a tape. But one of the things my brother-in-law said was simply ask Bob Lazar what division and group he was in, and just leave it at that. Don't give him any hints. Just ask him that question. Mm-hmm. But anyway.
How dare you not believe all of this? First, you don't believe in the Roswell slides. Now this. No, I agree with you. I'm a fence sitter on this thing, too. Although I did totally disagree with that argument. I think that's kind of silly. I know people I worked with or I went to school with in 1980. I can easily remember. Of course, I'm not going to remember every kid at my school, but I'm going to remember a few people. So there's got to be people out there like Dr. Krangle who remember Bob Lazar if he really worked out there. So, I mean, that's completely possible. Not only that, this is an interesting part of the story, is Jeremy was using bots. I don't know where the hell he got these or how he uses them, but they're these bots that go out to your Facebook. They're looking at your Facebook. So he's like the NSA. But he's grabbing people talking about Bob Lazar, and he'll go look to see what they're doing. Anyway, they said, this person just said, my neighbor says he worked with Bob Lazar. So Jeremy got a hold of that guy, eventually became friends with the neighbor, and the neighbor said, yeah, I really did work with Bob Lazar. So, I mean, that's why this person never came forward before. That would make sense.
Okay. So, all right. I mean, I'm open to the fact that it's possible, but also it's, I want to say, closer to improbable than possible. But if it's really factual, great. It's kind of a little bit of a mystery. That's all.
Yeah, it's funny. Right after I posted this story, within a minute, John Alexander pounced, and he's sending me emails. This is ridiculous. I worked at Los Alamos. He wasn't there. So it's kind of funny. It's certainly
out of 9 or 10,000 people, how are you going to tell who's there and who's not?
Well,
even if you're a physicist,
worked with him, though, you would know. If you
I know,
met
but
the guy.
For John Alexander to say, he was not there.
Oh, exactly. I know. For example, exactly. And your point about subcontractors is exactly correct. In fact, Dr. Krangle told Jeremy that most of the employees out there are subcontractors now. And I think we hear this a lot. In fact, most of the people that the federal government hires these days are contractors. The percentage is super high. They've talked about this lately. But, you've got a number of great points there. I think, though, I give this guy the benefit of the doubt just because of his really impressive background. And there's no reason that this person should be putting his reputation on the line for making statements like this. So it's entirely possible.
Unless
working at Los Alamos is still a big leap from working on extraterrestrial spacecraft.
That's right. Yep.
So we're no closer to that.
And, I listened to the interview, And, he did sound, pretty cool and stuff like that. But, there are people out there just looking for a little fun, a little fame.
True.
So I don't know. I'm not 100% into it. But anyway, Poor Peter, I told him we'd be calling him 5 minutes ago. He's waiting by the phone. So we got to go, Alejandro, but it's been great. Thanks so much for doing this live.
All right.
And we will see you later next week.
All righty.
Thanks a lot, man.
Yep.
National UFO Reporting Center, good afternoon.
Well, hello, Peter. How are you? It's Martin from Podcast UFO. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Martin. Good to be here. Looking forward to this. Always enjoy talking about my favorite subject, UFOs.
Yes, I've always enjoyed your great enthusiasm when you're giving your UFO reports. It's always a lot of fun. And there's a lot of ground I want to cover, and we can talk about what's going on lately. But first of all, I want to say again, welcome to the show. And how did you get interested in this topic, Peter?
Yeah, I think I can honestly say I'm interested in it because I think it was July of 1954, I saw a UFO as a young boy with my entire family, with literally hundreds of other people who saw the same thing at a drive-in theater, and I've been captivated by the subject ever since. Clearly something of immense magnitude and gravity is taking place on this planet, and most people don't know about it. Frankly, now that I am a scientist, much older and a scientist by training, I consider the field of ufology to be the most compelling and the most important scientific subject that has ever stood before man.
Wow.
So I'm afraid I'm hooked to it.
That is quite the statement, and I have to agree. It's funny. I have a son that's always been very skeptical of this, and he enjoys me talking about the show and guests and things going on, and he's starting to say things like, "Wouldn't it really be something if this is if this is really happening? How exciting would it be? It'd be so it would make the world a lot less boring." I think he said something like that.
Boy, that's the truth.
Yeah.
If the UFO phenomenon is a real phenomenon, it adds an immense new dimension to our understanding of the galaxy and universe that we live in. Mm-hmm. And I believe it does. I believe we are dealing with a real phenomenon. I wouldn't have spent the last 21 years of my life running the National UFO Reporting Center if I didn't feel that way, frankly.
Yep. Now, when you had this sighting back in 1954, you said your family witnessed it as well. Were there other people involved?
Hundreds of people at a drive-in theater on the south side of the St. Louis airport, and I have written up a detailed description of what happened, and posted it to our the National UFO Reporting Center website, ufocenter.com, and people can read my description of what happened, and it's not just a question of whether I might have been making something up, because whenever my family got together, my parents and my older brother and I got together, we would talk about it. What did we see? What did it look like? What did it do? And so on and so forth. And there must have been at least hundreds of people in that drive-in theater that night. It was in July of 1954, I believe, was the case. I remember that because I remember the automobile that we were sitting in, and we had that automobile in 1954. Mm-hmm. So July of 1954, Lambert Field, St. Louis Airport, was a dramatic sighting. An object as big as a full moon in the night sky, the color of a red traffic signal. And it was initially, when I first saw it, it was hovering motionless in the night sky. Suddenly, as I was looking at it, it suddenly accelerated and went right across the airport. It executed an S-shaped turn over the airport, disappeared over McDonnell Aircraft Corporation, and that was it. The whole sighting, I estimate, Martin, lasted, I would say, perhaps 10 seconds at the outside.
Wow.
It was really quite a dramatic sighting.
Uh-huh.
Interestingly, my father was in the air traffic control tower at the time on the other side of the airport, the north. Back in 1954, the tower was on the north side of the St. Louis airport. Now it's on the south side. But he was standing in that tower on the north side of the airport looking at the object with binoculars, as were the air traffic controllers on duty at the time.
Wow. Amazing. Did they notice on the radar as well?
Don't know. I was 6.5 years of age at the time, and
yep.
If I had been 67 instead of 6, I would have been asking them those questions. But at 6.5, I didn't ask the questions that a good, seasoned investigator should and would ask.
Yeah, of course. I just wondered if later on, if the subject came up, where your father might have mentioned that or not.
I don't recall at this time.
Now, were there other sightings that was he always was he an air traffic controller?
No, he was an executive for a major American airline, and we were at the airport that evening because he had to do some work at his office. And of course, back in the 50s, things were much different than they are today. He knew probably most of the people who worked at the airport. And so he happened to go up into the air traffic control tower to visit with his friends who were air traffic control operators. And they were just standing up there gabbing, I presume, when they saw that object on the south side of the airport.
Wow. Now, one of the things I wanted to talk to you about tonight was you were involved in Incident Exeter, working on that. I might be jumping too far ahead because that was back in '65, right?
That's correct. September 3rd it occurred. And I was involved in it through an act of serendipity. I worked for a newspaper in southern New Hampshire at the time. I lived in East Derry, New Hampshire.
Oh, yeah.
Most people who are familiar with the state know where Derry, New Hampshire is, popular place for politicians to go and talk now. And I worked for the Derry News for about probably 9 or 10 months. And somehow, some way, the editor and I got on the subject of UFOs, and he was an absolute dyed-in-the-wool skeptic. And in about the first week of September 1965, the year I graduated from high school in Derry, we had a very dramatic sighting in Exeter. It was covered by the Manchester Union Leader. And my editor read that article, and he came to me and he said, "Peter, you're now a cub reporter. I want you to go up to Exeter, New Hampshire, and get a story for us about this sighting." So I made several trips up there. I talked to the two police officers, Hunt and Bertrand, who had seen the object while they were standing together. I talked to a hitchhiker, a young 18-year-old boy who had been chased by a disc out on a rural highway near Kensington, New Hampshire. Technically speaking, the sighting occurred in Kensington, not in Exeter, but the Exeter police force was involved. So I wrote a two-part article that was published in mid-September 1965, and in the year 2000 actually wrote the piece on the incident at Exeter for Ronald D. Story, who edited the UFO Encyclopedia, wrote the piece about the incident at Exeter. It was really very interesting, very dramatic, and that was my second experience with UFOs.
Wow. Can we, for the listener out there that's not familiar with that case, I think it's one of the big cases. Well, I think it's probably in the top 20 or 30, I would imagine, as time goes on. I don't know how you feel about that, but
yeah, it was pretty dramatic, and a lot of people were involved. It really started not in the wee hours of the morning when the hitchhiker, his name was Norman Muscarello, as I recall, was chased by the object. The incident had started apparently about 4 hours earlier. Officer Bertrand was on patrol, and he came upon what they call a roundabout, a traffic circle up there. And as I remember, there was a car that was parked in the center of the traffic circle, which was very unusual. Cars don't go there. It's grass. So he investigated, and he found a woman who was hunkered down on the floor of the back seat, and her dog, as I remember, was hunkered down on the floor in the front seat. And she was telling, when he approached the car, she started explaining to the officer that she had been chased by a disc from a nearby town, and in desperation, trying to get away from it, she pulled up on the traffic island. Well, he didn't know what to make of that, but she was taken to the hospital, as I recall. And later that night, about 2 or 2:30 in the morning, he heard a call to all units from their headquarters in Exeter to the effect that a young man had just burst into the Exeter Police Force office, and he was quite excited, quite muddied. Obviously, he'd been in a swamp or a thicket or something like that, which had indeed been the case, talking about how he had been hitchhiking on a rural road near Kensington, and he had been approached by a saucer that scared him so badly he started running. In final desperation, he jumped into a swamp, which was on one side of the road, and hunkered down under some bushes. The object that had chased him pulled right above him, and it rotated 90 degrees, so it's now pointed, the edge of the disc is pointed down at him, and he said it hit its high beams. He said he's never seen light as bright as that. So I interviewed all of these people who were involved, and I was left convinced that they had experienced something quite real, and to them at the time, quite frightening.
Right. What did you ever think of the supposed debunking of a airplane refueler? Did you ever hear that one?
Oh, I've heard a lot of attempts to debunk it or claim it wasn't true, but I talked to the witnesses literally days after they had their experience, and one of the police officers, Officer Bertrand, had been in the U.S. Air Force, and the notion that he would mistake refueling aircraft for a UFO is just utter nonsense. So these claims always come forward, are always presented after a major event like that has occurred. I suspect there's a concerted effort on the part of, I suspect, the government to discredit the case, and if they can't discredit the case, they'll try to discredit the people.
Right.
People who are involved in it.
Peter, we're having just a little bit of sound issue. I'm wondering if you could make sure that you're right up to your phone.
You bet.
Okay.
Is that a little better?
That is better. Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Let's talk about NUFORC. Is that the first? This is you actually man basically most of the work on that. don't you?
Yep, I'm the only person here. And
I wanted to say that, but I can't believe you can do it. It's a
pretty major effort for sure. And some days I wonder how I've done it, and most days I wonder why I've done it. But I think the principal driving force is what I mentioned earlier. It's the greatest scientific question before mankind. Are we alone in this universe, or are we not? And clearly, the answer to that question from my seat here at the National UFO Reporting Center is we are not alone, and there is some fundamental relationship between these creatures that we presume navigate in these ships that are being reported to us that we are not yet aware of. And if we can prove that they are there, and maybe we can talk about my proposal for doing that later in the program,
sure,
using passive radar, if we can prove they're there, it's the greatest scientific discovery of all time.
Yeah, many times I brought up on this show that this is such a passing phenomena that cannot be repeated. It's there, like you mentioned early on that sighting, where there was a 10-second involvement in what you saw. And a lot of times, that's all you have. The other day, yesterday, I was in Boston, and something caught my eye and in the sky, and I went to get my phone, and by the time I got my phone ready to take a picture, it was already gone. But by the way, it's kind of funny. It ended up being a blimp, and it was like going through the trees. So, but it really, something caught my eye, and it looked different. But a lot of times you just don't have time to react.
Yep.
You're fumbling, and you're like trying to find. Now we all walk around with cameras now, basically on our phones, or a lot of people do. But it's still when I had a sighting back in 2006 and by the way, I'm going to talk a little bit about this. I had no idea that it could be reported. I didn't even know that was an option. But when I had my sighting, the last thing I would have thought of is grabbing a camera. I was just so mesmerized and like, what the heck?
Often happens. People are so focused on this strange object that they're looking at before them that they don't even stop to think to get a photographic record of it.
Right. And so about reporting UFOs, like I just mentioned, the only thing I could think of was to call the police department, which I did. I got the runaround. It was not a fun experience, but I had no idea who to call. But even with that going on, I'm saying maybe I don't know if I'm what you consider an average person out there, but I was a person that had not seen anything before. That happened. I didn't know what to do, and I think that has got to be a major percentage of people that have sightings. They must come up with the same thing. I don't know where to go with this. And then some of them think to go online and take a look, but I didn't.
Yeah. Most 911 facilities across the country know about our center. So if a person dials 911 on his telephone and goes to the local emergency response center, most of them, perhaps all of them by now, have our contact information, both website as well as hotline telephone number. They should have given that to you. I guess there may still be a few Luddites out there that don't have it, some hangers-on, but most people, if they call the local 911 facility, will be given our number.
Isn't that amazing? That's great. I really think that's great. And, one of the things I was thinking about, all these reports come in. Would you have a guess of how many per year that you handle?
Yes, I am posting probably about between 6,000 and 10,000 reports per year. Although we get vastly more than that, most people do not want to submit a written report. It's one of the hardest things in this job is trying to get people to write down what they've seen. Most people just want to talk about it. They want to call, they'll chit-chat for maybe 5 or 10 minutes. Most people want 30 or 40 or 50 minutes to tell me the whole story, and I try to stop them from doing that. what I want people to do, if they believe they've been witness to a UFO, is write out a detailed description of what it was they saw and submit it using our online report form. So we get many more calls than we get reports. And what people see on our website probably represents a third of what we receive. So, for example, in the month of June, we posted between 500 and 600 reports to our website, and that might represent, the 1,000 or 1,500 contacts we had, and most of those people don't follow up with a report. It's a great tragedy. And here's an interesting factoid, Martin, that you might find very interesting. It is my estimate now, after having done this job for 21 years, it is my estimate that out of 20,000 or so Americans who witness what they think may have been a UFO, only 1 out of 20,000 will ever report it.
1 out of 20,000?
Mm-hmm. Isn't that odd?
Oh, my God. I had no idea. I have been in rooms like in conferences where the speaker, for instance, Richard Dolan once said, how many people think they have seen a UFO, and watch the hands, and then how many people reported it? And, it's just a few hands go up. Now, and here's the thing about that. If these people are at a convention about UFOs, they're more likely to be the type of person that would have reported it than not. So then you factor all that in. And so if you do the math, you come up with an enormous amount of possible sightings per year. I mean,
Absolutely.
Unfathomable.
Yes, I agree. And it's very frustrating to us who know that most of the reports are falling through the cracks. It's very frustrating that we're not receiving those reports. And I have never heard so many excuses in all my life as I've heard running a UFO hotline as to why people cannot write it down, cannot write down the details of their sighting. It's sort of disheartening, actually. But fortunately, there's some many diligent people out there, enough so we're getting a fairly steady stream of high-quality reports from those relatively few people who are willing to write it down and report it.
If you had to guess why a person wouldn't go through with the report once they contacted you, why would you think that might be the possibility?
Yeah, I don't think we have enough time remaining in this program for me to cite all of the excuses that people have leveled at me. It's just amazing. So a lot of people say, well, they're in a sensitive business, and
I was wondering about that. Mm-hmm.
They would pull their top secret security clearance and they'd lose their job at the solid landfill, something like that. And on. They don't want their family to know. They don't want this person to know. It's just amazing the excuses that people will come up with that will get them off the hook of writing just 1 or 2 or 3 paragraphs to describe what they saw.
Well, in a way, I understand, the ridicule factor is all part of that. Because, just for instance, going on further about the sighting I told one person that I worked with the following Monday or whatever it was. And I said, now don't tell anybody. And, it wasn't too long, maybe a couple days later, there was a lot of teasing going on.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Well, that's the advantage of having a National UFO Reporting Center, and we do essentially the same thing that MUFON does. They do a good job at collecting reports as well, but that's where the guaranteed anonymity comes into play, because if a person reports to our center and we post the report, nobody will ever know who had submitted the report. So they don't have to worry about ridicule. Nobody will know who they are who have submitted the report to our center.
We have a message up on the message board that kind of dovetails this, and that is Matt wanted to know why that witness information wasn't up there, and I realize that it is, with anonymity, you can get truthful information and a lot of information out there. However, is there ever a point where someone wants to be contacted by someone who investigates a particular case or something like that?
You bet. But most cases, in my opinion, usually do not warrant the amount of resource you have to dedicate to an investigation. A distant object in the daytime or nighttime sky probably does very little good for an investigator to go out and interview the witness. If it's just a distant object, we'll probably never know what it is or what it was. What I encourage people to do, and they can be their own investigators, and we live in a society in which everybody expects somebody else to do the work. That's why committees are so popular. But in fact, the witness can do a great deal by contacting the press, radio, television, and newspapers to apprise them of that person's sighting and to ask them if the person can get some publicity or if the news media would publicize it and encourage anybody else who might have seen the same thing to come forward. But for some strange reason, people hesitate to do that, even though the press is often willing to impart anonymity to a witness. I don't understand it. In fact, the young people are sort of interesting. It's a bit distressing when I encourage them to contact the press. More often than not, in dealing with a person who's maybe 25 or younger, they'll say, "Who is that?" They don't know who the press is or are. And I say, well, radio, television, and newspapers. And they say, well, do you have any telephone numbers for them? And I say, no. They're in your area. Look them up in the telephone book and apprise them of your sighting and see if you can get some publicity. And almost invariably, they do not do that. It's very strange.
One thing, I work with almost 30 young people in a startup. I do a lot of them are 25 or under. Most of them, and every single person there knows that I do this show, and not one person gives me a hard time about it. And that some of them listen to it. Some may be listening right now. So
good.
I think it's a good thing that young people are, interested in this subject because, and this is going to segue into my next question. We need this to carry on. It's very important, I believe, the same way you do. But speaking of carrying on, with all the work you do, and you're really totally dedicated, do you have a predecessor, someone that will pick up when you're ready to slow down a little bit?
Yeah, that's pretty well provided for. That eliminates the possibility of somebody being able to eliminate the hotline by eliminating me. Wow. We've made a provision for that, and the person is aware of it and is willing to take it over in the event that I'm not able to do it. And that's a good point. I have an immense amount of material, most of all a database that now has about 108,000 entries in it, and
wow.
that work should be continued. It's far more important than the welfare of one single individual. And so...
Do you think this person or people would have the same dedication that you have?
Well, once they started taking calls and receiving reports, I think they would. It's an addictive pastime. If you're interested in UFOs in the first place, to have free reign of the hotline is an immense luxury because you see what's going on not just across the United States but around the world with respect to the UFO phenomenon.
Now, one of the things, MUFON is another place where people call in and, give reports. There's investigations and all that. has there ever been any talk about some type of unity between different organizations, even internationally, that you're aware of?
Oh, yes. Everybody wants all these UFO organizations to unify, and one person wants control of it. And to date, I've avoided that. MUFON has actually proposed that to me so that our databases are merged. But I've decided that I really don't want to do that. I don't want to have worked for 21 years only to give all my information away for free. So I think a little competition is probably a good thing, because if there were one body that controlled all of the flow of information, and that entity decided to make a decision that the contributors were not pleased with, it would be sort of the Greek syndrome, alluding to the situation in Greece this week. Many of them would want to withdraw. So I think a little competition is a good idea, and there are enough UFO sightings and sighting reports to keep all UFO organizations plenty busy. If we're catching, if my estimate is right, that only 1 out of 20,000 UFO reports is ever reported by the witness, then there's plenty of work to be done still, and enough for many UFO organizations is what I'm trying to say.
Up on the message board, we had a question. Someone wanted to know basically what your thoughts were of the government if, it remains to be seen whether the government's covering up. I think there's, in my opinion, it's a possibility that there's some fragment of the government, at least, that has covered up in the past, possibly still, or most likely still, I would say, because, there's still reports coming into the Air Force and that are just hush-hushed. But what do you think it would take? This is the question on the message board. What do you think it would take for the government to finally admit that these things are happening?
Well, I think it's going to take an overt display, something like the Phoenix Lights back in 1997, March of 97, so that the government's position is just made extraneous. They've been lying to the American people about UFOs, I believe, since the 1940s. After you've been lying for that length of time on a subject of that gravity, of that importance, then it's very difficult to do an about-face and say, well, we've been lying to you for 67 years, but now we're going to come clean and tell you what's really going on. So they've painted themselves into a corner, and they're probably trying to figure out what they're going to do if there's a really dramatic, overt display of UFO presence in the near-Earth environment. And in fact, we're getting a lot of reports that, in my opinion, fall under that category. A lot of reports. And the most interesting phenomenon currently, in my opinion, is the reports of displays of clusters of red, orange, yellow, amber, and gold orbs or fireballs. Call them what you will. We really don't have an adequate term because we don't know what these things are, and we probably will not know until we have a long-handled butterfly net that allows us to reach up and snag one of these things and bring it down to the laboratory bench. But the U.S. government is a strange bird. In fact, my greatest concern is not the UFOs. My greatest concern is the possibility that our governments are now coordinating their activities with alien creatures. And when I look at what the U.S. government is now doing to the American people instead of for the American people, which is what they should be doing, in my opinion, I get very concerned. And some of the examples are the U.S. government seems dedicated to taking firearms away from the American people. That's not their job, of course. Under Article 6, Paragraph 2 of the Constitution, any public servant who takes an oath of office swears and testifies to the effect that he or she is going to defend and protect the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And suddenly, as soon as they take office, they're trying to re-engineer the country and re-engineer individual citizens' lives. So when I see this take place, and I ask myself, why are they doing that? And I bounce it off the UFO phenomenon, it makes me wonder what's going on in Washington, D.C. Clearly, those people know about UFOs. If I can, with nothing more than a telephone, a computer, a tape recorder, and a dedicated webmaster, can collect 108,000 UFO reports and post them, I can just imagine how many the U.S. government must have in its files. Must be in the millions.
You know, that's right. That is. While you're mentioning this, I mentioned earlier that I didn't know who to call when I had my sighting. The Air Force was one of the things on my mind. Like, should I call the Air Force? And I imagine that a lot of people do. A question up on the message board. And by the way, if you're listening live, you can jump in to the message board. It's right on Podcast UFO. And we're taking calls in the second hour of the show. And, this darn chat room just goes away on me. Here we go. What is your point of view on the most effective way for disclosure to take place, other than you're saying a massive sighting?
Yeah, well, I've been over that ground before. It's a very good question. It's very pertinent, and my response is very simple. Please read the paper that is posted to the homepage of the National UFO Reporting Center, the paper in which I describe the use of passive radar for detecting the presence of UFOs in the near-Earth environment. The paper was written in preparation for a presentation at the MUFON Symposium in Denver in July of 2004. And the day MUFON published the abstract, the one-paragraph abstract of my paper, I got a telephone call from a senior officer at the Central Intelligence Agency in Washington, D.C. He called from his office. It was during daylight hour, during work hours, and he said, "Mr. Davenport, I am so-and-so." He said, "I am a senior officer at the Central Intelligence Agency. I've been with them for over 2 decades." He said, "To let you know how senior I am the person who gives President Bush his daily briefing every morning at 6:30 a.m. He said, "A retired colleague of mine just sent me a copy of the abstract of your paper." He said, "If you build the radar system that you describe in your paper," he said, "you will be successful in answering the question of whether UFOs are real or not." He didn't say, he chose his words very carefully, of course. He didn't say you will detect UFOs, because that probably would have had him violating a secrecy oath. He just said you will be successful in answering the question of whether UFOs are real or not. Well, we've had several conversations and exchanged emails since that first conversation. That first conversation occurred on the 6th of July, 2004. And this guy is very interested in UFOs, and he described to me, he has a PhD in physics. He described to me the fact that during the first decade or two of his work at the CIA, his principal responsibility was building passive radar systems for the clandestine detection of targets. So that tells me several things. One, that my proposal for breaking down the barriers to UFO secrecy has merit to it. It also tells me that the U.S. government knows fully well what's going on, and they probably are operating passive radar systems all the time and see UFOs, I suspect, on a daily basis.
Wow. Amazing. So that is that's on the NUFORC website?
Yes, it's been there for 11 years, and I rarely get a comment. But I solved the problem. We can build a passive radar system. And many people probably are not familiar with passive radar, but if they go to our homepage, last Wednesday, we updated the homepage, and I put some links and some articles about passive radar on our homepage, and people can read about it, and they will see that human beings, we mere citizens and civilians, are now, because of the developments in computers and the global positioning system, we are now able to detect UFOs and track them by ourselves. We don't need to rely on the government anymore to do that for us.
Wow.
I think that's pretty exciting. And what I've been touting this system for over 20 years. I've been to 4 billionaires. I've explained it to one, and I've sent letters to the others. And we could build this system out of pocket change in their coffee fund. And yet I have yet to receive any funding for my proposal.
Yes.
It's very strange.
Yeah. Yep. There's a few other people out there with some ideas. We can talk about that a little bit in the second hour. We're going to take a quick music break. So, well, that's it, everyone, for the first hour. Thank you for listening. If you would like to support the show, you can listen to the second hour for $1 a month or more. And for any $10 supporter per month, I will go ahead and send you a free T-shirt. All you have to do is sign up, and it's right on our website, podcastufo.com. Peter is a great guest. He goes on in the second hour. It's a real fun interview. Hope you get a chance to check it out. And I want to thank everyone for helping us out with the show. First of all, Alejandro Rojas with the news. We'll be doing that live, hopefully, from now on. I also want to thank Peggy Shunning for managing the Facebook page. Remember, you can find all the latest UFO news on our Facebook page just by liking it. Next week, we have North Carolina's MUFON spokesperson, Israel Curiel. Nice gentleman. I met him when I was down there a few years ago. Well, that's it for the show tonight. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next week. Remember, you can listen live every week for the full 2-hour show on the Dark Matter Digital Network. And remember, keep your eyes to the sky.